But tonight, we have Martin Pfeiffer here, and he's a student in anthropology at the University of New Mexico. His main research focus at the moment is nuclear semiotics, the ways in which we create, negotiate, and circulate meaning about, around, and through nuclear weapons. Pfeiffer, though originally from Louisiana, currently lives in Albuquerque with 3 feline roommates, Jupiter, Cloudy, and Little Fluff.
Malinkaya.
So let's welcome Martin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for having me here tonight. Let me set up time-elapsed, I think. Button twin me. Yeah. And then I press this to make go forward. Okay, so I usually talk to myself quite a bit, and that's a little unnerving to have it broadcast to everyone. Like my nightmares. But seriously, thank you for having me here tonight. As per our title, we will be discussing nuclear weapon laboratory advertising, 1956 through 1964, by Los Alamos and Sandia primarily. A topic that is not discussed by very many or studied by very many. So I did want to especially say thank you to the Los Alamos Historical Society for having me, Cheryl for putting up with me and for driving, the University of New Mexico Anthropology Department, and then my various patrons and sponsors, without whom I could do nothing because research is expensive. All right, what are we doing tonight? Brief outline. Who am I? We'll talk about that in just a moment, although you have a taste. What am I doing here? What are we doing here? And then we'll actually start going into the data. And there are basically 4 major parts or arguments that I want to discuss, and we will go through those in turn, and then finally we'll have conclusions, questions, and answers. Nothing super mind-blowing or groundbreaking here in terms of organization of talks, right? Who am I? I am 4.5 year, in my 5th year of anthropology PhD at the University of New Mexico by nuclear semiotics. Basically, I'm interested in how we create meaning using signs, not just linguistic signs, but using signs, and then how that has material impact and does social work. So basically, I'm interested in how we communicate and how that communication does things. My contact info, test site, we can move on. If you Google search my name and the Open Science Foundation, I do have all of the ads that we'll be discussing tonight, along with the rest of my scans of ads from this time period, available to the public for free. So the ads we're discussing tonight are not comprehensive examples of every type of advertisement that Los Alamos and Sandia published at the time. They're advertisements that I've selected because they are thematically related and they allow us to discuss particular historical and social points. So let me just throw that out there. That said, they are all egregiously racist and sexist through the 1950s and 1960s, and I mean everybody's ads. It's like, I think Mad Men was an undersell. What are we doing today? Sorry. We are having fun. That's the first thing we're doing, and I hope we're doing that already, and I'm sorry if not. I'm an anthropologist, not a historian, so we're going to compromise. We're going to do historical analysis in 2 elements. I'm going to talk about change and continuity, some of the ways that these advertisements came to be, complexity, causality, explanation, etc. I probably need that. And then we're going to turn more toward the anthropological viewpoint or anthropological critique aspect, where I start becoming concerned with issues like power and the distribution of benefits and costs to various peoples. Okay, so once again, data analysis, just a brief outline to keep everybody grounded. This is Cloudy, by the way. He has an ongoing war with my computer. It's a strange relationship we have. So let's start with by the numbers. We'll start, everybody knows, I assume, what and where Los Alamos is, how it was started, and so on. I will skip that one. I will also note that this is the single advertisement in the period I examined, in the publications I examined, in which Los Alamos included a mushroom cloud. Sandia Corporation, I assume, but this one's a little bit less well known, right? Offshoot in Los Alamos, even beginning in the summer of 1945, it kind of became its own thing in 46, became the Sandia Corporation, was the ordnance engineering arm, shifted more towards research and development out of building stuff in the 50s, right? So by the time that we're really starting to talk about for these advertisements, by 1956, 1958, Sandia had changed from being like, all right, this is where we're gonna throw things for storage and where people are going to build pieces for the bombs into, this is the liaison between the design laboratory and the military in terms of putting the kaboom into an actual military usable package. And so, like I said, there was that shift in focus from production and more into research and development and working on new and future systems. One thing that's always worth remembering about Sandia, and if you forget, they will tell you, they were not UC Berkeley system for most of their management time. UC Berkeley pulled out, and instead it was AT&T Bell. And Sandia highlights that lineage as having been important for its culture and for the actions that it's taken. And I think that you can probably see some elements of that certainly in the advertising that we're going to be discussing also. We just won't talk about California. All right, a lot of numbers. So I spent a whole spring break going through every page of every issue of Scientific American and Physics Today, 1950 through 1964. I saw some stuff. It's fascinating. And in it, I pulled out amongst them, right, these particular advertisements. So Los Alamos and Sandia, the earliest ad is in 1955, and then they run right up until, by both laboratories, right up until I stopped flipping through pages in 1964. The two journals, we can discuss another time one of those journals. Los Alamos had the most types, so I did not collect a total number of advertisements placed, right? I looked at types, individual types of advertisement, different advertisement. So I didn't necessarily count how many times a particular type of advertisement was in. I was counting and looking at the types of advertisement. So for Los Alamos, this was about 100 between that period, and for Sandia, significantly fewer. I don't know why that is, actually. It's something that I would really like to know. I can say that as far as I'm aware, both labs were using Ward Hicks advertising, which you may recognize, right? Very prominent, or at least very famous in New Mexico. My understanding is that Ward Hicks advertising was important and associated with coming up with the Land of Enchantment tagline as part of like a highway department thing. It's kind of a weird story, but it does seem that Ward Hicks handled all of these ads, and I based that conclusion on both, I think it's Scientific American is very nice in those days to have a list of advertisers and who the agencies were, and also on internal consistency of the advertisements across time, issue, and so on. Okay, I don't know about y'all. I guess we'll get to that later then. Okay, moving on. I don't know about y'all, but I don't really see a whole lot of advertisements about nuclear weapon laboratory recruitment these days. Y'all might. So the question becomes, why did, or one question to answer historically, why start publicly advertising in public journals, not in closed publications or these classified forum or even unclassified forum, but like why in mass journalism, mass publication journals would you start advertising? This seems like it would be an extremely easy question to answer, and it's really not. It vexes me greatly, actually, how difficult it is and how much it matters on whom you ask. So Sandia, in part in their official history by Johnson, they argue that with the coming of the test moratorium, they were able to be more open and accessible to people, and therefore felt enabled to advertise publicly. I absolutely agree with, well, we'll get to what I think. So you'll remember, of course, right, that the test moratorium ran 1958 to 1961 with the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union ended it in 1961. The labs hated it. The labs have always hated it. If you read the declassified documents, the labs really, really hated it and were not fans of it, and it caused a lot of disruption. And the worry about the moratoria, and in fact the actual impact of the moratorium, I will argue, had a significant impact on the advertisements and what they say in them, right? The other reason, another potential reason, if we listen to the RAND Corps, which is always dicey, but you know, they have done some great stuff, but let's listen to RAND. And RAND has this incredibly economically complicated argument that we see so many advertisements in this field of technology and engineering because of changes in governmental owned contractor operated fee contract structures. And so it therefore became cheaper for some companies to just have ads out all the time for people on a job that you may not get, a contract you may get, and then you never had to hire them and so on. So you could just, okay, we didn't get that by, rather than having like a permanent staff that would be working on it. It's kind of a weird argument, actually, I'll be honest about it. Common sense seems to kick in here too, and of course our good friends at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because yay data. After World War II, the demand for people who were technically and scientifically trained increased, and the number of jobs in those fields increased significantly, like more than significantly. And you can see that, right? And you can see that that starts kicking off World War II, post-war, and there are various reasons for that, including the influence of World War II as like the quote-unquote science war, imaginaries of atomic modernity, the GI, you know, people having their college paid for, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's all of the above, actually, or at least I don't, in my own research, I've not really been able to identify one factor as being more so explanatory over the other, such that like you can say, this is why. And I think it's probably an amalgam of all of the above. More so, I think that it's, or in addition, I think also it's partly a response to concerns that the supposed 50s consensus around US domestic and foreign policy issues and nuclear weapons, including atmospheric testing, fears that that was coming to an end, that the American public was becoming more restive and questioning more often, right, decisions about nuclear weapons policy and being less supportive of nuclear weapons. And so that would also be, you know, a move, would help explain like why you would feel it necessary to begin advertising, because advertising is in part a performance of the self, of who you want to be or who you are claiming to be, and who you want to come work for you. Again, the test moratorium. So in addition, the test moratorium, especially when it kicked in, resulted in major shifts in terms of where money was going, what people were doing, and so on. The labs, both Los Alamos and Sandia, began picking up outside work from, you know, non-government work. There was increased focus on technology transfer, which continues to this day. I'm most familiar with it over at Sandia. And this is also where you're seeing the nuclear weapons complex in the late 50s kind of crystallize into a fairly mature form that it would keep for the next couple of decades. You know, I mean, some things change, but in general, that's how it was. So I think that all of those come together into explaining like, okay, here's the context and why, the causality of why there was advertising at this time. Because I don't see this in Physics Today and Scientific American anymore. It would be fascinating, actually, but it doesn't happen. So before we talk about the advertisements themselves, let's talk about some of the big themes, right? Ultimately, I argue that these are settler colonial, or that they're articulated to projects of settler colonial placemaking. So to define that, right? Placemaking is constructing a relationship between oneself and a space, grounding oneself in it, laying claim to it, you know, making it your own, right? Placemaking is making a place meaningful. By settler colonial, right? People come in, you displace, erase, genocide, or whatever the previous occupants, and there are usually relationships of asymmetric resource exploitation, labor exploitation, and asymmetrical distribution of cost and benefits of whatever it is you're doing. So, and this is not a call out of the labs per se. Like, this is something that, it's a very common practice everybody was doing, which doesn't make it okay. But we're going to discuss it in terms of what we can see in the ads, that at the same time as the labs were attempting to ground themselves in the quote-unquote American Southwest as Southwestern institutions, they were also doing so in ways that reflected larger social imaginaries of how the world was and how the world should be, and not all of those were great. What else am I arguing here? Oh, yes, so these are the settler clans, right? Erasure of displaced occupants and claims. We'll talk more about these sort of modern versus non-modern contrasts and dichotomies. When we go through the ads, we'll talk about Southwest imaginaries and Western imaginaries and how those got pulled into conceptualizing of nuclear weapons. By imaginary, I'm referring to this sort of collective, shared, performed, and institutionalized sense of the way the world is or the way the world should be. So it's more than ideas, and it helps guide people in making things material, right? So if you believe that litter is litter is that first thing, like after litter, Rome fell, right? If you believe that, there's the material impact that you may pick up litter, etc. Right? There's an imaginary involved there, at least on an individual level. So we will discuss two examples of that. One, Los Alamos' relationship with the Taos Moderns, whom I had never heard of previously, and two, this fascinating series of advertisements from Sandia in which they explicitly justified nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons work, which is not something that I expect to see in like a Scientific American in Physics Today by a nuclear weapons laboratory, especially not in the terms presented at the time. We'll discuss that. And then, bringing in the historical aspect. We will also discuss, how these ads reflected larger context and social movements, particularly regarding race and gender, and equal opportunity, and the move toward non-weapon work, which is a fascinating one. So these are ads from, the first two are Los Alamos, the third, let me see actually what sort of resolution you can get on this. Right, first one is Los Alamos, and then Sandia. Generally, Native peoples, indigenous peoples are not presented in the advertisements at this time. They're kind of referenced to in this sort of like, oh, they've already vanished, or they will vanish, or they've already disappeared, or if they appear, it's textually and it's only as like these quaint little add-ons to living in these cities. So it's this nice bit of ancient culture you can visit when you're done with the lab. So there was a move from like these sorts of like extremely explicitly sexist and racist advertisements toward, along with the evolving social mores and regulatory structure, towards something a little bit different. This is kind of an interim moment, right? So this is 1961, and you still have like man's accelerating progress, right? So it hasn't moved into the gender neutral or more gender neutral language. Qualified applicants, which is kind of like the sort of gender neutral thing they said eventually settled on, it appears. And then the non-discrimination statement, which is all qualified applicants will receive consideration for employment without regard to race, creed, color, or national origin. U.S. citizenship required. What about women? Right. So this seems to be kind of like a transitional spot, and Sandia and Los Alamos both went back and forth between their formulation of this, and eventually everybody settled on kind of the same thing, and that is, right, Sandia Corporation, equal opportunity employer. And I assume that that was especially the case after 1965 with the passage of the Equal Opportunity Employment Act, but that sort of language and regulatory structure was already starting to come into place by the early 60s, and so you can see it evolve in the language and the format of these advertisements. So in this one, right, there's no reference to men or women. It's like we want people in these degree areas, which fits in with the next trend that we're going to talk about. Any questions so far, by the way? Am I making some sense? Okay. If I start speaking Greek, let me know. I don't speak Greek. One of the other big trends is, at least for Sandia, because Los Alamos always focused more on things like basic research, research and development, and kind of like science rather than saying, we build nuclear weapons, right? Sandia, beginning in 56 through 58, 59, just had this set of 4 or 5 advertisements that were extremely explicit about, what they were doing and their goals, in a way that really, like I said, was unique for the advertisements that I've seen. Sorry, I'm trying to look for the exact ad text here. So on one like the Peacemaker, which is superimposed, right, the Peacemaker onto a mushroom cloud, which also, and we'll talk about this in a moment, hints at, right, at the time, Westerns were incredibly popular, like Western movies. Westerns have this very particular masculine imaginary notion of like violence that gets repeated in some of the ads that we'll see, and that I would argue is still present in some of our discussion around nuclear weapons, which I don't think is great. And I think of things like Swagger, or the ways in which we discuss deterrence as this kind of like slugfest, and so on. In any case, to get to these particular ads though, so Peacemaker, the text in it is, they called this weapon the Peacemaker. In the hands of the Western lawmen, it brought peace and order to the turbulent frontier. In the West today, so there's a placemaking claim, right, an articulation of the institution to a long-standing tradition and to a long-standing activity rooted in that particular place. In the West today, Sandia Corporation engineers and scientists explore new frontiers in research and development and engineering to produce modern peacemakers, the nuclear weapons that deter aggression and provide a vital element of security for the nations of the free world. Similarly, Warhead. Here again at Sandia, we follow a similar pattern. In a pursuit of our main task, we study many things, blah, 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 blah. So there is some movement by Warhead toward like, okay, we do things other than nukes, but certainly Warhead and our product is not for sale, are very much like, we make nukes, we make deterrence, that's what we do. And Los Alamos never did anything like that. Like they would say, we are the prime, they would describe themselves as the country's foremost center for the study of fission and thermonuclear research. And this is after Lawrence Livermore came onto the scene. Which, I love those little jabs at each other. So continuing that trend, however, so we can mark out a point for Sandia, at least in history, where like, all right, they were really cool about being super explicit and super connecting their work to the production of nuclear weapons and nuclear armament. Okay. However, when we look at later advertisements, it's very different. And like I said, Los Alamos has always been different from Sandia in this respect. But if we look at later advertisements, Sandia discusses much more things like, we study material science, we study the physics of a shock wave. Our centrifuges are the best sort of thing. And they still mention like, yeah, we're still the prime contractor for nukes, but it's not like, come centrifuge your way to a better nuclear weapon in the same way that some of those other advertisements were. And this continues to today. So if you spend too much time on Twitter, or if you're obsessed and this is your area of research, Cheryl, stop laughing at me. And if you've ever done a not quite statistically valid sampling of like Sandia and Los Alamos tweets, about 90% of them are not directly or explicitly nuclear weapon content. And it's, on one sense, I mean, I get it. It's, there are reasons for that. And at the same time, like if we look at it in terms of funding, Sandia, I looked it up today. Thank you, Cheryl. Because she was arguing with me about it, and I appreciate that. So today was, Sandia's 57% on NW, nuclear deterrence, as they call it, ND stuff. And so it's odd to me that there's that disparity in terms of like what they talk about, what we are funded to do. And like I said, we can come up with the reasons for that. So that's, right, quick to that. Making nukes Southwestern, Los Alamos followed a little bit different of a path than Sandia did, although there are similarities and overlaps. And as I mentioned, right, these are some of the techniques through which settler colonial placemaking can operate. So you have performance of the claims and connections to place. And in this ad, let me find the text on it. right? This ad speaks of at Los Alamos, creative people are finding that intangible extra that makes their work more satisfying and give their lives a lift. This extra is found in the splendidly equipped laboratories. You'll find it too in the spectacular scenic setting high in the green pine-covered mountains of northern New Mexico. The many churches. It's in the healthful climate, the cool summers, and the mild winters. What? For scientific research and enjoyable living, Los Alamos has no equal. Right? So there's always this sort of nature-culture dichotomy that's being invoked, in which Los Alamos, the laboratory, is the apotheosis of atomic modernity, and the natural surrounding is this like place you kind of go to have fun. There's no mention of archaeological sites. There's no mention of continuing relationships to the site by other people, right? Los Alamos is saying, this is ours, and this is what you can get out of it in this moment and in this event. Also, you'll notice, right, everybody's white, and everybody is apparently heterosexual if they're coupled. So that touches on all three of those. That progress narrative through modern, anti-modern contrast, we'll see that especially when we go back to the advertisement on like Warhead. Sandia is really explicit about that in a way that Los Alamos is not. Los Alamos does it a little bit more subtly, and they paid artists to do it for them, so they used a different semiotic process. Placemaking, logos, right? Both laboratories straight up raided, Southwestern imagery and culture and appropriated for the construction of a logo that ties the organization expressly to the quote unquote American Southwest. And that furthermore does so in a blending of older native elements to more like high tech or futuristic enterprises, right? So the bolo tie, the history of it is apparently much more complex than we need to get into, right? But like I said, bolo tie native and American Southwest associations, and then Los Alamos turns it right into a stylized aspect of the atom. I also once heard a joke that you could always tell between the engineers and the physicists by who wore bolo ties in the 50s and 60s. I don't know if that's true or not. No laughter. Moving on. Sandia, the Thunderbird logo was the result of an employee contest for length of service jewelry. And the person who created it explicitly says, yep, I look to what I believe to be local, native, custom, tradition, artistic expression, and I made it more futuristic, and like, here we are. So this is a very potent act of placemaking. The logo, did you have a question, ma'am? Yes.
About the logo.
Yeah, please.
One of the previous pictures, earlier pictures, it showed a pentagon around the Thunderbird.
Can we get back to that one at they did smaller things to it, but what do you mean by a pentagon? Like,
Well, there was a pentagon drawn around the.
Keep going.
There it is. There it is.
yeah, okay. So there were minor stylistic things, but it's still the same Thunderbird
Yeah.
logo. Actually, I hadn't noticed that. Thank you.
But I didn't know if that was a significant.
Nope. I mean, it may be. So this is one of the annoying things about history and why I'm not a historian and why I'm an anthropologist. I like being able to pester people with questions. I especially like it if they're required by federal law to answer me, which is less common than I'd like. So I'm not sure if that's significant or not. I've filed a Freedom of Information Act request. It's so old and they don't have the documents. There's a box at the Southwestern Center at Zimmerman Library from Ward Hicks Advertising. I'll get to it one day, and maybe that will answer it. But good eye, thank you. But the whole point being, right, even with the sort of minor stylistic differences, the main foundational thing of like, okay, this is an appropriated, modernized version of the Thunderbird remains. So, like I said, I had never heard of the Taos modernist. I am also not an art historian. Los Alamos, there are a lot of really good reasons, I think, or a lot of very fitting reasons that Los Alamos would choose to have artistic interpretations of concepts that didn't always lend themselves to artistic interpretations. And that furthermore, they would select these artists at Taos to do it. altogether, there were something like 22 of what I call these art ads. So 22 different original interpretations of concepts like clandestine nuclear testing. It's one of my favorites. Mobile plutonium, we have one, right? Mobile plutonium fuels. Creativity. And like there's one that's just, you'll see it in a moment, that's just terrifying, right? So things that didn't always lend themselves to perhaps this sort of artistic interpretation, and yet Los Alamos reaches out to Taos, which at the time is in its second wave of modernist influence after World War II, beginning to, or experimenting with avant-garde techniques, with trying to capture essences of things, color combinations influenced by New Mexico, right? Okay, we'll get to that. So here's one example. So let me go back actually, sorry. These are some of the names. These are the people who all had 2 or more. There's like Louis Roybach. I believe that he had 1 and then like one other, oh, no, he has 2. There are 1 or 2 people who have like 1 and I just left him out. I cannot guarantee that William Townsend is part of like the Taos modernists. He was apparently a UNN instructor for a while, and then he went to Humboldt, and there's a gallery named after him. I don't really see him mentioned a whole lot with Taos in my searches, and he did 8, so it may have been that he was cheap and they liked him. I honestly don't know. The others are much more firmly established with the Taos art community and art colony. So this is Emil Bistrom, who, as I understand it, is also like a big name. Yes, sir.
Were these advertisements from a contractor, or did they originate within the laboratory? How did they?
So this again is a
PR guy?
Yeah. So this again is a problem for of history, in that in anthropology we deconstruct these sorts of communicative situations into author, animator, principal. So as you rightly point out, the product that we see as the advertisement is not a single person coming up with a single thing that's then getting put out. It's a committee process. And what exactly that committee process is or was, I'm not totally sure. So I have to speak of it, and what I speak of it is in terms of drawing on, for example, my reading of the newsletters of the time, drawing on social conditions of the time, drawing on other things that Sandia has written, drawing on things that Los Alamos has written to make these sorts of arguments. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, these are committee decisions. At the same time, as committee decisions, they can tell us so much more perhaps than like if Los Alamos had just said, you know what, I'm gonna, have a picture of the grounds, right? And instead, it's like Los Alamos clearly went through the effort to engage in a communicative, persuasive act. And in doing so, we can therefore imply or infer from that these ads are not just like random, that some thought went into them, that somebody got paid to make them and somebody got paid to think about like, how does this express Los Alamos? How is this Los Alamos, right? So it helps us perhaps be a little bit more confident that these advertisements do in fact have a connection to like Los Alamos' concern with itself, its own performance of itself and its performance to others, and its own institutional identity. So Emil Bistrom, whom as I understand it is also a fairly large name, abstract painter. Which one is that? That's, my favorite. Scientific objectivity characterizes everything we do. As an anthropologist, like, opening doors to knowledge. I can get this one a bit more. Scientific objectivity, a little bit less, right? And then some of them are more referential than others. However, I would argue that part of what attracted Los Alamos to the Taos Moderns and the other examples of this artwork that we'll see in these advertisements is the non-referentiality of it, the abstractness of it, the movement of things like molten plutonium fuels into such a technologically hyper-advanced state that you can only represent them as ideas rather than like systems, in part because the systems didn't always exist. So it's a statement, right, that we deal with ideas, not necessarily things in a certain manner that we're going to present. I think it's also very hip in the 50s and 60s to be like, we're going to use this sort of modernist art in our advertisements. Come work for us. We think outside the box. Bolo ties, right? Luis Ganthier's doing what is undoubtedly one of the most terrifying renditions of creativity I have ever seen in my life. If you zoom in and out, it looks like people screaming, right? Molten plutonium and mobile fuels. So again, some of these things I question whether or not an original painting or an original artistic interpretation was necessarily the best way to do it. Los Alamos clearly felt so. So again, it was we can infer that it was a purposeful intention choice and worth paying attention to as one of an empirically observable markers of what Los Alamos was trying to do at the time. And then finally, since he did 8 of them, and he's perhaps the most referential of them, William Thomson did one on, this is on RF, radio frequency structure. This is one on predicting the behavior of plutonium fuels or reactor fuel elements. Plasma confinement, like, okay, I could get that in Pictionary. And then Project Sherwood and thermonuclear exploration. Looks like a high-tech, hip company I'd want to work for, right? Yeah. But notice also what's missing. There's not that Sandia, some of the other Sandia ads, for instance, like have a lot about, oh, there's housing and there's great stuff to do outside and there's schools. I mean, it was mostly lies. There was no housing. There was lots to do outside and, great cultural experiences and so on. But all of that is basically stripped out of this in these ads. So we've moved from like early on where Los Alamos was talking a lot about leisurely living, and it may still get mentioned here, into these like very, very technically focused, very, very abstractly technical advertisements. And there's a particular like sense of institutional identity associated with that, I argue. And yes. All right. Let me actually find the notes for this one so I can read parts of those texts. Logos. Well, that completely didn't go as planned. In any case, so the way that Sandia, what I want to talk about with regards to Sandia in terms of its form of placemaking is very different from some of what Los Alamos did. It still did, again, there's overlap, but Sandia is unique in this collection of advertisements that explicitly engage with the topic of nuclear deterrence and explicitly make arguments in favor of nuclear weapons work and nuclear deterrence. I found my other notes, right? So, as we've talked about with Peacemaker, right? And at the time, by the way, Western movies were one of the single most watched forms of movie entertainment in the country. That finally died down in like the early 1960s. But it's absolutely zero surprise regarding No Second Best that's one cultural trope that Sandia may have reached to. But if we look at all 3 of these ads, we can see a particular masculine imaginary of violence and deterrence and force, right? So in the case of Peacemaker, we have already been told that in the hands of Western lawmen, they brought peace to a quote-unquote turbulent frontier, which is an amazing euphemism. And that now, right, modern day lawmakers at Sandia and the US government are making modern day peacemakers nuclear weapons to bring peace to a turbulent frontier. It's an odd analogy, and I don't think that in the event that's how nuclear weapons, certainly not how deterrence theory, but nuclear weapons in the event it actually played out. If we look at No Second Best, again, as I mentioned, you have the sort of prototypical high noon moment. And also, across all 3 ads, you'll notice the modernist, hyper-modern versus the sort of a-modern past distinction. And we'll talk about that particularly in Warhead, but we already did somewhat in Peacemaker, right, where Sandia is presented as the future of the Southwest, the natural successor to what has come before. And in No Second Best, the ad text basically reads like, I will find it. If you're not first in this industry, you're last. As long as there are people with, a goal toward duplicity and ruling the world, well, then we'll just have to have the best nuclear weapons ever. As an analogy, this is terrible. If you look at like the rates of fatalities in gunfights, like that, back in the West, I mean, first off, they didn't happen very often. Second off, usually, everybody dies, or you get ambushed, or you kill, somebody standing nearby, or so on. So again, it's not about reality, right, and historical fact. It's about a particular collective set of notions about how the world was and how the world should be with relation to violence and the role of violence in power that Sandia and Los Alamos are both, in different ways, engaging with. Does that make sense? Cool, awesome. It's like my dissertation. Can I just have my degree and go? So Warhead, and we've got 6 minutes. Warhead we'll go through really quickly, and this is the one that, so I'll just read it from the screen, right? Centuries ago, the Indians of New Mexico designed and developed warheads like this one. Today, right, temporal marking, natural successor to the native peoples of the area, we at Sandia Corporation do very much the same job. Who would have known that stone warheads for hunting and that sort of warfare are the same thing as making like 25 megaton, whatever. But again, it's about the imaginary and the construction of a linkage in people's minds, right? But we call it research and development on the ordnance phases of nuclear weapons for the Atomic Energy Commission. So the people who made these primitive warheads also applied many of these skills and techniques to produce implements of peace, grinding stones, knives, needles, and quite a few others. Here again, so they're resonating again, both as being the natural heirs in terms of place and in terms of purpose. Here again, we at Sandia follow a similar pattern. In the pursuit of our main task, we study many things in widely varied fields ranging from nuclear phenomena to numbers theory, from meteorology to metalworking. We learn basic scientific facts and advanced techniques that have important applications far removed from nuclear weapons. Then they continue with this sort of frontier imagery. We probe new frontiers of science and engineering. We meet and solve challenges. So Warhead is an outstanding example of both the sort of modern contrast of the nuclear weapon labs and the people who were there before, and native groups as being placed in the past, gone, ancient, but still building a continuity through a trope, right, of something like a warhead, of something like a pistol, even though the actual material conditions or similarities between those analogies may not be necessarily the greatest. It's advertising, right? And so it's intended to change minds and to do social work and eventually to have a material impact on the world. And so I hope that in my talk tonight that we've touched on some of the ways that historically Sandia and Los Alamos have done that. And I would argue some of the ways that continues to happen, right? So when we discuss nuclear deterrence and nuclear warfare in terms of prisoner's dilemma or in terms of a standoff or so on, we oftentimes close ourselves off to other ways of understanding human relationality, power outside of violence and force, right? How we think about these things matters. And so in the current moment, I think that there is great space for concern about how certain imaginaries of violence, power, and nuclearity continue to be associated for US and world policymakers. Oh, cool. I actually managed to hit all of my conclusions without looking at the slide. And so there's my master's advisor always said, end up with the big, so what, why should I care? And so that's my big, so what, why should I care? The way we talk about and think about nuclear weapons matters, what we do with them. And when you're talking about the end of human civilization as it matters, it's best to have a good idea about how that functions so that you can explore other alternative ways that may be more effective, or not, in which case you can return to your old. So, any questions? Yes, sir. Or, I'm sorry. whomever. I moved it. Oh, that's terrible. Sorry.
That wasn't me. I think there's a good reason why the Los Alamos and Sandia ads are, very, very different. And that is that the words Los Alamos are recognized all over the world,
Yeah.
anywhere. And they know what the business of Los Alamos is. So then the laboratory says, well, we need to tell them other things we do as well, the focus on basic science and whatnot. Sandia didn't have that name recognition. Unless you really were knowledgeable, what does Sandia do? So they had to tell people exactly what they did.
That's a really good
Which is
point.
why, their ads are, as you point out, so much more direct on the mission.
And some of them are more circumspect than others. And I'd definitely recommend you check out the full collection that I have posted online. And I would love if you have additional thoughts on themes, tropes, areas I may have been hideously wrong and hallucinating and confabulating or whatever. And that's why I make this sort of thing public, is so that it's more than I can ever do in one career. And it's certainly things that I would never think of, right? So, this is a topic that I've been studying 2-3 years, and the idea of Los Alamos having more brand recognition is just not one that I've come across, but I think it's absolutely, I think it has some explanatory power there, very much. And so, the next step in terms of research would be to go back and to look at, for instance, I know that there's opinion poll, it's mostly in the 40s, starting to look at, what data is available to support that? Can we, so as a semiotic anthropologist, one thing that I might do is go and look at opinion poll data and how many people in 1956 recognized Los Alamos, and so on. And it would probably be the vast majority, right? So that's a really good further avenue. Thank you.
Since you included logos from Sandia and Los Alamos, I'm surprised that you didn't use logos in your presentation tonight from UNM.
Which one?
How the U and the M?
Technically, I think I'm supposed to. I'll add that. Thank you. I thanked them explicitly. That's but also an excellent point, right? And this is something that I didn't get into as much with this talk. Those particular magazines, so you speak of the UNM logo, right? As a logo, logos call forth particular associations about the institution and the people associated with them. And so, by including the UNM logo, for instance, there's a genre performance of both thanking them, but also of hey, I'm actually ratified. UNM is they don't know I'm here, but they would be okay if they did. My advisor knows I'm here. But no, that's an excellent point. Thank you. We have one, just fine.
So I assume that these were recruitment ads, or were they just informative ads?
I think that they served a variety of purposes. And at some point, some of the advertisements were very clearly more directed at recruitment. And at other times, that aspect seems perhaps a little bit less foregrounded. Yes, ma'am.
Did you think that there might be somebody in this room who responded to one of those ads back
Did you?
in the 60s?
Is there?
When I was a senior engineering, mechanical engineering major at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, that was 1960. I was at a newsstand just browsing through Scientific American.
Yeah.
And there was a recruitment ad that showed a picture of the new TA3
Yep.
with Hamus Mountains in the background. And I thought, gee, that's a neat place.
Yeah.
That's what encouraged me to apply, and here I am.
Fascinating. Yeah, and again, you had that mixture, right? The Jemez Mountains, and right, all these wonderful outside activities, and this really hyper modern activity going on here. And yeah, it's a great question, because the ads, They were at times posted when the workforce of Sandia and Los Alamos were going down. So can you really consider them to be like, maybe they were hiring for different jobs than were being whatever, but it certainly makes problematic the assumption that they were purely for recruitment. But thank you for sharing your story, because it also reminds us like they were for recruitment. Two people.
You looked at these ads and how you interpreted them, and if you or anyone else, is there any way to see how they affected others? Or this is part of the answer.
Yeah.
But did they succeed? Did they accomplish anything of any kind? Is there any way to measure that? Have you thought about that? Has anyone else thought about that?
I have thought about it because the question has come up, right? And something like recruitment would be fairly relatively easy, it seemed, right? Was there ever a an employment shortfall mentioned in the newsletters or something else? Regarding the other stuff, especially with a diffuse cultural product like this, it's incredibly difficult.
In modern era, advertisers know a hell of a lot about
Yeah.
what their ads do. At that time, and in this area perhaps, there was no such thing, but that would be very interesting to have any idea what, did it change people's mind, did it accomplish something, did it annoy people, did it, anything.
One thing I have seen, excellent point, and this encourages me to go to that box at the Center for Southwestern Research from Ward Hicks, because Miracle of Miracles, maybe they have some sort of assessment, or they did focus groups or something like that, which would be awesome. I would also look at this as part of these advertisements were one tactic amongst multiple being done, across a very widespread organization to maintain funding, personnel, and relevance at a period of significant social shift. Again, when you ask how do you measure whether that larger effort, which should, and its effects be much more easy to determine, it's just virtually impossible, both in the moment and especially historically, usually, to tease out exactly what it is that caused the American, Castle Bravo probably did more to destroy the reputation of the Atomic Energy Commission than anything else during the 1950s, straight up. And so I'm not sure how much it's just, now I can ask people at least, and again, this is part of why I'm an anthropologist, not a historian.
Did you look at any other labs, like Oak Ridge or anything? Were they also advertising or not really?
Sandia and Los Alamos were the most prolific. There were some from Lawrence Livermore, what became Lawrence Livermore. There were some from other national laboratories as well, non-weapon related laboratories. I would have to check to see if Oak Ridge had one. If they did, it may have been I kind of don't think that, I don't remember one, but it's been a little while since I went through all of it. If it may have been of the type of hey, Oak Ridge has these hot cells and these irradiation areas where you can bring in a tank and we will irradiate it and then cut it up, in a hot cell, dissolve it in nitric acid for you. That may have been private company though, but I think it was based in Georgia. But that's a really good question too, is if they didn't, why didn't they? And if they did, why did they do so in different publications? And Scientific American and Physics Today. So Physics Today, the reason why those publications were chosen, although Sandia also did some in Newsweek or whatever, but I think the ads were slightly different. But Physics Today was chosen in part because it offered access, right, to a technically educated readership who were interested in a general overview of the field and who may or may not be currently employed. Scientific American seems like maybe it was a little bit more of a stretch, because the readership was different and it was more of a general population. And so Scientific American may have been like a throw-in for, hey, let's get maybe some of also these technically trained people or people interested, and also do some larger population work. But again, without access to the deliberations, it's very difficult to say for certain. But great question, and I should FOIA Oak Ridge for that. I'll tell them you told me to.
I was making the same observation that what you've shown us would mostly be recruitment. But if the intention of these was recruitment, it seems to me that these two particular national publications were kind of too broad of a target, sort of missing the target. So if I have a question here, it would be, were they at the same time doing more traditional direct recruiting on campuses?
Yes.
And if they were they using these ads, or were their campus recruitments taking a totally different tack and different ads?
Let me answer a question slightly different than the one you asked, because that's the one I can answer. And one is to say that yes, they were apparently doing more traditional campus recruitment activities, and they mentioned that in the ads themselves, and that's also included in Sandia newsletters and in the official history of Sandia. I am uncertain about the ads that those people did or did not use, or what their procedure for engaging with students was. At the same time as these two and that's an excellent question, thank you. I had asked Sandia, like, hey, do you have a complete list of your advertisements and the magazines you publish them in? And apparently that does not exist. Through cross-referencing with, yeah, I know. Freedom of Information Act, y'all. But through cross-referencing with like the official history and such. For instance, I know that Sandia was also advertising in Nucleonics, which is a much more technical, narrowly focused publication than these two. Like, you're absolutely right. I do not know if the ads in Nucleonics were the same as these. I do know, for example, that like one of the advertisements published in Newsweek was not published in either of these publications, and it was a much more simplified version of the gun with the mushroom cloud sort of thing. But that's not enough to make like.
Yeah, it seems like, particularly some of the animals, that particularly when they're incorporating these Taos Martinis, those look like those would have been expensive.
Oh.
And so you can see them placing them in national magazines.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point too. Thank you. But so there's some of their earlier ads. I didn't mean to get my apologies. Some of their earlier ads, in 1955, were just like text. So, but that was also a movement across the board in the two publications that I examined. So I have a total collection of about 1,000 different advertisements from various organizations. But that was kind of an across-the-board movement from more plain text toward the inclusion of colors and graphics. So again, I don't know, and as you point out, those couldn't have been cheap.
You mentioned hot cells. You and others may enjoy this story. I was told by a division leader, Don Sandstrom, many of you know him, has since passed on, that he was visited, his division was visited by a reporter, I think from Albuquerque, and they went around the facility and showed him the hot cells. And the discussion went on for 10, 15 minutes, and Don got the impression that things were going to more confused and more confused. And he asked the reporter, what do you think of hot cell is? And he said, well, I really don't know, but I assume it's where your cells get hot.
Ionizing radiation generates heat, close enough.
And that sort of thing can go everywhere, in ads and everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, one element that I have not discussed very much, and that I haven't looked at, right, is that the sort of in-group humorous aspects that are involved with perhaps not necessarily these advertisements, but some of the others. And we certainly see that sort of communication and signaling going on, for instance, in like Nuclear test certificates are deeply indexically coded documents that you have to like decipher. And I'm sure that there's stuff in these ads that if I, had a more contextual understanding would be like, So like it took me, a year and a half to realize Sandia ads, or at least Sandia ads, kept mentioning housing because right after World War II, housing shortage. And then it took me another 6 months to realize that Sandia was lying about the housing because Sandia was in a constant, Albuquerque was in a constant housing shortage during the period that they were advertising about. And that's one area where, semiotic anthro were big on pulling together lots of stuff and seeing how it informs each other. So like I had a Freedom of Information Act request that got me 50 years of the never classified Sandia Lab News newsletter, which offers an astounding temporal and thematic, resource. And so with that, I'm able to look at what was going on around these dates. And so that's how I'm able to talk about add a little bit more credence to claims of okay, this was actually a major social shift for them in terms of the moratoria. And here's also where we start seeing a lot more discussion of non-weapon or extra government work. And so it's stuff like that that would go into a dissertation or a longer talk.
I must have spent decades looking at the old LASO logo of the particle interacting with the atom. And it never occurred to me that was supposed to be a representation of the polarized particle.
And an atom, yep.
So I have to ask, what documentation is there that was an intended subtle inference or anything else like that?
I would have to track down the exact citation for you, but I can do that if need be. I would also argue just from a thematic, comparison with other sorts of atomic models of the time. I saw the original Independence Day in the theaters, and that came out when I was 14. It took me until I was 33 to realize that the aliens were a coded reference for human environmental degradation. And in that moment, I felt never less qualified to be an anthropologist. It took me 13 years. But no, that's an excellent point. That's something I would like to follow up more because I have a backstory for the Sandia logo, right? It was designed for jewelry. I would really like to know if there's any existing record of the creation of this, and if there's any existing records of design discussions or who signed off on it and what the sort of description was. So something similar to the Nevada test site, the Nevada Nuclear Security Site, has this mascot called the Grim Reaper, right, that interacts with children, and it carries a flower or staff and have a Freedom of Information Act out on it. But somebody thought this stuff out, and it would be fascinating to get a glimpse of that. And I'm just not sure if that's possible, given the extant historical record. Alan Carr might be a really good one to ask. So, thank you.
Other questions? Thank you again for coming this evening.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.